Hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Bolen. I'm a pastor at Midway United Methodist Church. I'm also a pastor at Edgewater United Methodist Church. I want to thank you so much for taking some time and for watching this video. This video is part of a series that I've been putting together. It's called Searching for a More and Better Life. And particularly in this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of things that are perennial as far as living that more and better life that Jesus invites all of us to embrace and to experience. And that is, what does it mean to trust and obey? And I will tell you that in this video that this is a response to a lot of comments, a lot of feedback that I've received from previous videos that I've been publishing and putting out describing this more and better life. And you may wonder, well, what in the world is this more and better life? It's a place in the New Testament, Gospel of John chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus says, "This is why I've come." Now imagine that there is this place where Jesus says, this is the reason that I'm living this life. This is the reason that I'm here on this earth. I've come so that all of you can have real and eternal life, more and better life than you ever dreamed of. And so what I did is, after many conversations and many comments, I thought it would be almost pastoral malpractice if I didn't take some time and just expand a little bit, just slow down a little bit, and describe exactly what it is that this more and better life with Jesus looks like. So that's what this is going to be. The last conversation, and one that I particularly had with some people as we were gathered around Zoom and working through some of this material about a more and better life that Jesus offers, is that we started thinking about, what are some of the obstacles? What are some of those things that are kind of hitting us in the face right now? What are some of those challenges that we face right now in living that more and better life? One particular area that we picked up on was the great resignation that is happening. Some people are even starting to do it. That was why I paused for a minute. But some people are even beginning to call it the great reset that is happening, where people are resigning from their jobs. But there's many obstacles. There's many things that can keep us from living this more and better life that Jesus invited us to. And so how do we do this? How do we help ourselves to embrace this more and better life? And also, how do we help others? How do we help others to find and discover that more and better life that Jesus offers to all of us? And commonly, traditionally, this is gathered up in this huge kind of understanding of trusting in God and being obedient to God. And you'll find, I got a few Bible verses that I want to share while I'm talking about trusting and while I'm talking about obedience. For example, this Old Testament scripture, this in the Hebrew scriptures, Psalm 111, it's a lot of Psalms, but Psalm 111, verse 10 says it this way: "Fear of the Lord is the foundation of true wisdom." I learned it, memorized it. As a child, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, I said as a child, but most likely as a teenager. Fear of the Lord is the foundation of true wisdom. All who obey God's commandments, his commandments, will grow in wisdom. And then if you flip into the New Testament, if you go into the New Testament, a book that's called James. James chapter 3, verse 13 says it this way: "Are there any of you who are wise and understanding? You should prove it. You are to prove it by your good life, by your good deeds performed with humility and wisdom." And then Jesus says this in John chapter 14, verse 15: "If you really love me, you will keep and obey my commandments." And not only is it there, not only this trust and obedience that comes out of the scriptures, but one of the songs that I learned, one of the hymns that I learned growing up, and even continue to sing with followers of Jesus Christ, is a song called "Trust and Obey," which says it this way. In the song it says, "Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey." As a responsibility that all of us carry as followers of Jesus, that part of the more and better life of Jesus, to discover, well, what is that more and better life of Jesus? It is our responsibility to say, okay, what is that more and better life that Jesus is offering to us? And also, what is that more and better life that Jesus is offering not only to us, but what is that more and better life that Jesus is offering to others? That is, the relationships that we have with other people. And so one of the really interesting aspects of all of this is that as we begin conversations about the more and better life that Jesus says, a real life here on earth, an eternal life that we will live eternally with God in the kingdom of heaven, that what does it mean to begin to embrace that life. And what does it mean to strengthen that life? What does it mean to live into that life and to invite others to live into that life? John Maxwell, wonderful writer, says this. Says, you really haven't changed until you change something that you do every day. And so taking that into account of the more and better life of Jesus, what is that thing that we change in our lives that is going to affect us every single day? And also, how do we do this with other people? How do we strengthen the other people that are around us, the people we find ourselves in relationships with? One of the interesting aspects of my own job, one of the interesting callings that I have in my own life is that what I'm talking about in this video is also what is lived out among groups of people. This is what happens at both Edgewater, this is what happens at Midway, but this is also what I get a wonderful opportunity to be a part of even outside of those churches, is that how do we live this life that Jesus has called us to live? And as far as my own calling, that God has given me, the scriptural basis that I use this is a place in the book of Ephesians, is a place that comes out of the book of Ephesians that says that God has granted that some will be apostles, some will be prophets, some will be evangelists and pastors and teachers. I'm a pastor. I'm also teaching is what I'm doing in this very moment. But and clearly that God has called some, God has given gifts to some that they can be pastors, that they can be teachers. But then it says this in the book of Ephesians, once again, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. Equipping the saints for the work of ministry. And that is one of the callings that I take very seriously in my one of the callings that I can take very seriously in my life as a pastor, is that what does it mean to equip one another? How do we equip one another to do this work of ministry that Christ has invited us to all embrace and to all experience? And so in this idea of a more and better life, how can we be equipped to live this more and better life that Jesus offers us? It's one of the things that I spend a lot of time in prayer about, but it's also one of the primary things that I meet with my leaders, and we talk about this all the time, is that how can we ensure that we are equipping people to do this kind of work, to equipping people so that they can experience this more and better life that Jesus has called all of us to embrace. And we also recognize that. We also recognize the challenges as well as the limitations that many of us have with this, is because the more and better life that Jesus offers, we recognize that there are a lot of people who look at their lives and they understand their lives are not more and better every single day. And 24 hours a day is that 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of us have challenges in our lives. And so how do we do this? Particularly, how do we find this kind of hope that Jesus is inviting us to embrace when we find ourselves in moments when we're just barely hanging on? Sorry, I'm talking really fast, so my throat was beginning to get dry. But some of those people that are just barely hanging on, some of those people are just keeping their head above water. And imagine how you feel when you're in moments, when you're in situations like that, and then someone invites you into this more and better life, and you say, wait a minute, I'm just trying to make it to the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month. Well, if you want to do something, if you want to change something in your life, which is what Jesus is inviting us to do, you've got to be able to lean into or either create from scratch and brand new, and hopefully and wonderfully we don't have to do this, but you got to create a system that will lead people to be able to embrace that change in what you're doing. And so one of the challenges that comes out of this message, and this is the part about slowing down, this is the part about just explaining a little bit better, is that how do our lives really change? Jesus said, I've come that you can have a more and that you can have a better life. And what does that look like? How does the life really change? Well, James Clear wrote this book called Atomic Habits, a wonderful little book, but essentially he talks about how behavior changes, how habits affect changes in our behavior. And he writes this, again, James Clear from Atomic Habits offers this quote: you will not rise to the level of your goals. You will fall to the level of your system. which is kind of interesting. And so that's what I want you to begin to think about. What is your system for changing your life? And how do our lives change? How do our lives change? And one of those things about one of those big overarching questions that we got to begin to answer for ourselves is that what is that picture of who I'm going to become? What does it look like in the future? If I'm thinking about changing my life, what is that going to look like? What are those changes going to look like? And also, what is the kind of impact I'm going to have as a result of that change? What kind of impact am I going to embrace? How am I going to experience the world in a different way as a result of that change? Now, you can look into the New Testament. There's a wonderful blueprint for this kind of change. It comes in the New Testament, book of Romans. This is a letter that the Apostle Paul is writing. Romans chapter 6, Romans chapter 7, Romans chapter 8 talks about what does it mean to change our lives? What does it look like to have a changed life? The Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the Romans. He will describe it in this way. He says there is a life in the spirit and there's a life in the flesh. He says that there is a new self that is emerging and there is an old self. So again, if you want to change your life, what is that future that you're imagining? What does that future change look like? And also, as a result of that future change, what kind of impact do you want to have on the world? Again, Romans chapter 6, 7, and 8 explains that, but just breaking it down and once again slowing down a little bit. For example, if you say this, if you say, you know what, one of those changes that I want to make, as a change that I made several years ago, but one of those changes that I want to make is I want to drink more water in the day. You know, as human beings, we are encouraged to drink a gallon of water a day. That's about 9 plastic water bottles. And you start to say, okay, how am I going to tackle this? Well, those first thing is a brand new habit. It's a brand new, that's what you want it to be. You want it to become a habit, but it's brand new behavior. And so you want to change it. And so that first step is that it becomes embodied in you, that you start to lean into this and say, you know what? I'm someone who drinks a gallon of water a day. This is one of those things that James Clear will talk about. Don't say, I would like to drink a gallon of water a day, but say, I am somebody who drinks a gallon of water a day. So you start to lean into it. You start to lean into new habits and you make an effort to be consistent. You try to do it as many days as often as you can. So again, you recognize, okay, what does that actually look like? Well, it's about 9 plastic water bottles. I'm going to set a timer on my phone and then I'm going to do it. And from that kind of embodiment of it, that embodied behavior, then it becomes embedded in you. Habits start to feel this habit of drinking water every single day. It starts to feel natural. It starts to seem normal. You notice when you forget to do it. You notice and you may start to miss it. And that moves into this place where this brand new habit becomes invisible, where these habits become automatic and they don't start to feel like habits at all. It starts to feel strange if you're not doing it. It starts to feel strange if you're not drinking all of that water during the day. And then it becomes a default setting where you don't even notice. This is a habit that's a normal part of your life. It's a part of who you are. This is just who I am. This is it is behavior that you do all the time. It becomes a routine. It becomes one of those things that is always taking place around you. Is automatic behavior that takes place. So how's a life change? Well, what becomes embodied, then it gets embedded in our lives, then it becomes invisible, and finally it becomes our default setting, just our way of life. Now, there's really interesting research that's been done just in the past few years on habits and the way that our lives change. You've probably heard that this idea about it takes 21 days to start a new habit. It takes 21 days to start this kind of new behavior. That's something that really emerged as a number that got thrown around, but there's not a lot of research around it. Felipe Sally wrote this article, conducted a study that was published in the European Journal of Social Psychology. Felipe Sally, he was a researcher at the University College of London. 2009 study discovered that on average, just in an average way, that on average it takes 66 days to form a brand new habit. to reach that level of just automatic behavior, automaticity. It was 96 people who were studied over a 12-week period, and they found that over that 12-week period, that out of those 96 people, that it took either around 18 days for some on the low end, and all the way up to 254 days for others. So about to begin this to form brand new habits, to have this kind of life change that happens in your life, it takes about 2 months or up to 8 months to build new behavior in your life. And so what does all this mean for us as followers of Jesus Christ? What does this mean for our spiritual lives? Well, in Romans chapter 6, verse 10 and 11, this is what the Apostle Paul writes. He says, when Jesus died, that Jesus took sin down with him, but alive, he brings God down to us. And so from now on, think of it this way. Sin speaks a dead language that means nothing to you. God speaks your mother tongue, and you hang on every word. You are dead to sin and alive to God. That's what Jesus did. And see, essentially, this is what the Apostle Paul is describing as what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ and what it means to be embracing this new life, this changed life that God has invited us to experience. And he will expand on this, and expands on it in an extraordinary way. You continue to read Romans chapter 6, and you'll come to verse 12 through 14, and it says that means that you must not give sin a vote in the way you conduct your lives. And so if you start to think about, okay, this is what we are just beginning to embody, that we are not giving sin an opportunity or a vote in our lives in how we are going to live our everyday lives. Don't give it the time of day. Paul says, don't even run little errands that are connected with that old way of life. And so what becomes embodied then gets embedded to our everyday lives. Throw yourselves wholeheartedly and full time. That this is something that you are doing full time. It is a part of your life. It is not just your spiritual life. It is not just your religious life. It is not just your faithful life, but this is something that you're doing full time. What gets embodied then becomes embedded, then it becomes invisible, then it becomes automatic behavior. Remember, you've been raised from the dead into God's way of doing things. Sin can't tell you how to live. After all, you're not living under that old tyranny any longer. You're living in the freedom of God. Again, this is one chapter. Romans chapter 6, it's verse 10 and 11, and then 12 through 14. Wonderful, wonderful idea about what does it mean to embrace this kind of changed life that God imagines for all of us. And remember, as we are seeking this more and better life that Jesus invites all of us to pursue. And so what we're moving toward is that everything that God has created us to embrace, everything that God has created us to be. And you may start to ask yourself, what has God chosen you for? Why has God chosen you? Well, it is to embrace and to experience this more and better life of John chapter 10, verse 10. And I'll say this is a really narrow path. Not all of us find ourselves in a place where we are making this kind of huge change in our lives, where we are taking on those new habits that God's inviting us to embrace, where they're becoming embedded into our lives, where they're becoming invisible in our lives, where they're becoming just a natural way, an automatic behavior in our lives. Jesus will even describe this. He says, you know what? There are a few people that even find themselves on this path. Jesus will say this in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, verse 14, for the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are a few who find it. Again, I've come that you may have a more and better life than you've ever dreamed of. Jesus himself, which is what Jesus says, but then Jesus also says there's a narrow road. And there's few that find this path that leads to this more and better life that Jesus invited us to do. And so what I want to do is I want to invite you to do something. I'd love to hear your comments, because I've gotten lots of comments in the past few videos on this more and better life, which is one of the great things about it, because this is what I think that really begins to open us up to growing in our own lives, spiritually as well as everything else in our lives. And so what I want you to do is I want you to begin to mess around with change. You've heard me as I've talked about drinking more water in my own life, but begin to mess around with change in your own life. Decide one thing that you will change in order to pursue the more and better life that Jesus offers. And if it is a place, as general as you want to be, I'd love to hear about it, either in email or some of the comments that you post. But also do this. Take a look at Romans chapter 6. Take a look at Romans chapter 7. Take a look at Romans chapter 8. Read it in a translation that you're not used to, a translation that you don't use all the time, and just read part of that. It is a wonderful beginning to end if you can read all of it. Romans 6, 7, and 8. And look in there. Look for at least 3 things that you can take out of that from the book of Romans that will enable you to live this more and better life. Some of those things that you can immediately put into practice. Some of those things that you can immediately begin to activate in your own life. And again, I want to share this. In John chapter 14, verse 15 through 17, we were talking about this. To trust in God, to obey God. Well, what I've described over these few minutes in this video is what does that really look like? How do we trust? How do we obey God? What is the actual change in our life that enables us to trust and obey God? John chapter 14, verse 15 through 17. This is from the Message translation. If you love me, Jesus says, show it by doing what I've told you. This is the kind of change that I'm talking about. I will talk to the Father, and he'll provide you another friend so that you will always have someone with you. This friend is the Spirit of truth. The godless world can't take him in because it doesn't have eyes to see him, doesn't know what to look for, but you know him already because he has been staying with you and will even be in you. And so one of the wonderful things about what Jesus reminds us in John chapter 14 is that it's not only us attempting to change our lives on our own. It is not only us that are attempting to take on these new habits in our life on our own, but it is the life that God has imagined us living. It is the life that we invite Jesus to come into our own lives and to begin to live in our own lives. And there is also the Spirit of God that is present with us. And so what we have as we begin to think about changing our own lives is what we have as we begin to think about what does it mean to begin to establish new habits, lasting change in our own lives. It means that we have Jesus who has come to us personally. It means that we have God who is calling us to this kind of life. And it means that we have the Spirit of God that is always readily available and present with us. And so, as you embrace this kind of life change, again, taking a look at your own life and saying, what is it that I want to change in my life? What is it that I want to mess around with in my life to offer change? Taking a look at Romans chapter 6, 7, and 8 and saying, what are some of those things I can take away with this? I encourage you. I wish you luck. And as always, I pray that God's blessings will be upon you as you embrace this kind of life change that God has invited all of us to. And I would love to hear your comments. Post them under this video, email them to the church, however you are watching this video. And may God's blessings be upon all of you, both now and forevermore.